Um, so my name is Sarah Ann Gresham, and I'm the co-founder of Intersect Antigua-Barbuda, and I'm also a PhD candidate in women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Rutgers University. And I would like to talk a little bit about Intersect Antigua-Barbuda before we begin our teaching. So Intersect Antigua-Barbuda is a Caribbean feminist collective which agitates for gender justice and Caribbean liberation through a strong anti-colonial sensibility. We are committed to different arrangements of being human that depart from heteronormativity, and we embrace Jamaica Kincaid's imperative of having a demanding relationship to history. Intersect was formed by Anika Nicholas and myself in 2015 at a time when we were both physically in Antigua and conducted in-person teach-ins and workshops with students from the Antigua State College, the Antigua Girls High School, the Clare Hall Secondary School, and the Antigua Grammar School. We have since received grants from the Women's Voice and Leadership Caribbean Program, the Equality Fund, Catalyze, and the Black Feminist Fund, CAISO, and most recently, the Global Fund for Women, to relieve some of the precarities of unpaid feminist organizing labor and to expand our programs. We invite you to delve into our website, and Lucia will share the link in the chat. That's intersectantigua.com, where we've curated approximately 200 essays, stories, poems, art, and photography across a range of themes from our Caribbean Feminist Stories project. So from our Artist in Residence program, to our teaching series, to our Caribbean Healing Justice program, we invite you to join us to co-create Caribbean feminist knowledge and freedom dreams. So joining us once again from the Intersect team is our resident artist, Lucia Murray, and I'll turn it over to Lucia to introduce themselves.
All right. So, hey everyone, I'm Lucia, also known as Lem. As Sarah said, I'm Intersect's resident artist. So I'm responsible for like graphics such as the one behind myself and Sarah. And I, alongside our resident historian, Shannon Graham, support Sarah in bringing all of our programs to life. And it's just been great thus far, from our artist in residence program to the teaching series that we're doing right now. And I'm grateful to be in this space with you guys today, and I'm excited for Dr. Lightfoot's discussion.
Awesome, great. And just before I introduce Dr. Lightfoot, I invite you to hop into the chat and just tell us your name and where you are joining us from. So where in the world you're joining us from. I saw a lot of people from Antigua who registered for this session, the most Antiguans to ever register for an Intersect teach-in. So I'm super excited about that. Hello, Javier from Barbados. Javier is actually part of the Intersect team as well. So thank you, Javier, for joining us. And we're looking forward to seeing where everybody else is from. Okay, so Dr. Natasha Lightfoot is an associate professor in the Department of History and faculty fellow in the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University. She received a BA in history from Yale University and an MA and PhD in history from New York University. Her research and teaching interests include Atlantic slavery and emancipation, Black community formation and acts of resistance, and daily practices of freedom in the 19th century British colonial Caribbean. She is the author of Troubling Freedom, Antigua and the Aftermath of British Emancipation, published by Duke University Press in 2015. This text focuses on Black working people's struggles and everyday forms of liberation in Antigua and Barbuda after slavery's end. She has also been published in the New York Times, as well as a number of academic journals. Her research has been supported by fellowships from multiple institutions, including the Ford Foundation, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and most recently from the American Council of Learned Societies. She also initiated a digital archival preservation project at the Antigua and Barbuda National Archives through a grant from the British Library. She is currently writing a book titled Fugitive Cosmopolitans about enslaved people's escapes from bondage, imperial subjecthood, and struggles for freedom between empires in the Caribbean. I am delighted to welcome Dr. Lightfoot to discuss her chapter, Sinful Connections, Christianity, Social Surveillance, and Black Women's Bodies in Distress, which appears in Troubling Freedom. Dr. Lightfoot critically explores the extension of unfreedom in the aftermath of abolition and the new modalities of governance, colonial surveillance, and biopolitical power exerted by colonial authorities and its appendages, including the Moravian Church. Dr. Lightfoot's text evinces the ways that the archives produced what Saidiya Hartman terms a grammar of violence that obscured and distorted Black sociality and community. Her text is an invitation to read contrapuntally, following Edward Said, and with a strong feminist sensibility, and reveals the importance of historical exegeses like hers to understand our contemporary political moment in the Caribbean and beyond. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Natasha Lightfoot.
Hi, everybody. It's really nice for, just to be here. I really appreciate Sarah and Gresham and the entire Intersect team for their invitation to speak today. It's an honor to share my thoughts with you on how post-slavery gender relations shapes Antiguan and Barbuda history and culture. I am going to share my screen, and I'm going to insert a caveat that I don't do well with PowerPoints. I usually race either ahead of the point that I'm on, or I'm usually, if not that, far behind the point that is up. So bear with me. I'm going to try to keep up with my own self. But so let me share my screen now and then get started. All right. Okay. Okay. All right. So I'm going to play this from the start. Can you guys see? Okay. So yes, starting off, just wanted to say that, as noted in Sarah's really generous introduction, my book, Troubling Freedom, looks at the decades between the early 1830s, when the British emancipate all of the slaves throughout their empire, and the late 1850s, to distill how Black men and women in Antigua and Barbuda navigated the rocky economic, political, and social transition after the British legally dismantled slavery. So, I was just thinking about how a few years ago, an Antiguan sociologist who is very esteemed in the field as well, and a mentor of mine, Paget Henry, created a conference and composed a theme that followed the arguments of the literary critic Hortense Spillers in her classic article, Mama's Baby. And he noted that the difficulties that existed regarding gender in Antigua and throughout the Caribbean region stem from colonialism and slavery. And in his words, per Spillers, he said, slavery in the context of colonialism wrought centuries of ungendering, quote unquote. And again, centuries of ungendering. So what I want to address in some depth is what gender relations in Antigua looked like centuries ago, in light of what becomes a haphazard process of regendering that actually happens in Black communities immediately after slavery, and the attendant forms of violence that come with that process. So each of my slides today have some images that hopefully illustrate visually the intellectual agenda that I'm trying to share with you today. And I'm starting with this image here of free Black women in 1840s Jamaica going to market with their wares, just to set a tone for, who were the archetypal women that we're talking about here, and what were they up to? Many of them were working for themselves and on behalf of their families. They were working on plantations, but also doing independent cultivation, with livestock. One woman is obviously carrying chickens on her head, right? So those kinds of images show you the sorts of hard work that women are up to every day. Pretty much there is no day off in the plantation society. Um, so I just want to move on and just give you a sense of what are the themes that I'm going to cover today. So the first point for discussion is this story of ungendering and how it, along with the violence that takes shape, are essential building blocks for social life in Caribbean slavery. Secondly, we'll then move on to emancipation itself, which is the meat of what I talk about in the book, and how that period involves a very serious retrenchment of the gendered violence of slavery in a lot of different ways. Then from there, I'm going to go into the specifics of how Christian churches represented a double-edged sword for freed women as a site of certain benefits, but also certain clear harms, as per the chapter you all maybe read, maybe you didn't get to, no worries, we can talk more about it. Hopefully this conversation will at least orient people who didn't have time to read, with what the major issues are that I'm trying to get across in this chapter. Then I will move into the specifics of Moravian surveillance, and in particular, how Sinful Conexions kind of form this site of church surveillance by the Moravian, mission on Antigua. I will speak specifically about what those connections, how they were defined, and what were the consequences of them. And then lastly, I'm realizing my slides are kind of blocked by our our face boxes, but hopefully, you'll see what I'm talking about. Freedom is a constant struggle. That's the end point. That's always the point that I end with everything. Every bit of my work is geared as a historian toward asking the question of how Black people historically tried to get free, what they thought freedom looked like, what they thought it felt like in their everyday lives, and the different ways that process was obstructed by the dictates of colonialism, capitalism, racism, sexism, etc. So now to get started on the specifics, first, we're going to talk a bit about the ungendering process and the violence of slavery. Oops, sorry. I don't even know how to forward this slide. Okay. So the forms of violence within slavery were multiple. So barbaric captivity and transport of millions of people from Africa across the Atlantic Ocean is one of them. And the image I'll talk about a little bit more in depth in a bit is an image, a representation of what the experience of the slave trade was like for the many millions who were taken from the African coast. After arrival in the Caribbean, Europeans would decimate hundreds of thousands of natives who built communities on these islands for centuries, and they expected superhuman toil of both African women and men as replacement labor in the fields and the mills to produce various cash crops for the world market. In Antigua, the cash crop of choice became sugar, as was true for many of the British-held islands in the region. Then there's obviously as well the enforced procreation among Black people, which regularly involved the rape of Black women and girls by masters and by fellow male slaves to produce more enslaved bodies for the profits of their masters. Black people generated profits for their masters both because they worked and produced crops, and produced all kinds of other objects of value, but also because in their literal persons, they embodied chattel property, carrying cash value. So people's bodies could be mortgaged, they could be used as collateral for the starting of a business, they could be willed, they could be gifted, just the same way that cash is done, was used back then and is used now in those many ways. While Black people were mandated to physically produce, they were also expected to relinquish any sort of familial connection to the children that they produced. Family ties were rendered very fragile in the face of the extreme authority that masters wielded over Black parents and children to use, abuse, or dispose of enslaved people at will. And those who dared object to or even showed slight reluctance in their compliance with this violent status quo were met with brutal punishment and in many cases death. These were the messages sent to Black people from their earliest encounters with the colonial enterprise, which again came through the slave trade. So the young girl in this image that I've put up is being punished on a slave ship for rejecting the slave ship captain's advances, the captain being the man in the blue coat on the left. And she is said to have died following her injuries, because this was an actual depiction of punishment in a slave voyage. And just note that it's not physical, but it's also quite sexualized punishment, because her bare body is laid out for all of the men in the crew, as well as the captain, to see and, gawk at, and to basically, see her experience that all of her body experiencing all of the violence that is meted out toward her. So violence regulates all aspects of how African people are inculcated into this system of bondage. And moreover, this system of bondage and the violence that it was built upon worked, as I said before, to ungender Black communities. And I would add that it did so ironically in very gendered ways. So it might be confusing, but hopefully I can explain. So the foundational categories that were used in slavery's erection, maintenance, and eventual dismantling rested upon implicit understandings of gender that are critical for any serious discussion of Antigua and Barbuda's very rich history of working people's struggle. I'm going to reference my colleague, Saidia Hartman, who Sarah also referenced in her introduction. She's a literary critic that teaches at Columbia as well. And in her work, she has noted that we have been typically taught in the public discourse to conceptualize the struggles of the slave, either in the context of them being workers or as resistors, by automatically seeing said slave figures as male. So in her words, quote, "It has proven difficult, if not impossible, to include Black women's domestic labors and reproductive capacities within narratives of the Black worker, within narratives of slave rebellion, marronage, or Black radicalism, even as this labor was critical to the creation of value, the realization of profit, and the accumulation of capital in the history of slavery," end quote. So, yet the way that slavery propagates itself in the British and all other enslaving empires throughout the Americas is through the principle known as parta sequitur ventrum, which is gender. This idea, this is based in Roman ancient slave law, and it translates from the Latin literally as the child follows the belly, which means that basically, and this was used in Roman slave law to determine the ownership of slaves and livestock. So if I have a cow and Sarah has a cow and our, has a bull and our, livestock mates, who owns the litter is who owns the belly that they were produced in. So if I own the cow, I own the calves, right? And so slavery's future essentially rested on the active wombs of Black women who could legally only give birth to enslaved children. Another slavery scholar, Christina Sharp, has noted that this principle turns the Black woman's womb, quote, into a factory, reproducing Blackness as abjection, turning the birth canal into a domestic middle passage, end quote. So Black women and their bodies are the primary and most consistent sites of the institutionalization of the violence of slavery. Their bodies produced generations of slaves while their labors were just as dehumanizing, just as severe, and rendered Black women as equally beastly to the eyes of white people at the time as were Black men. Right? So Black women are seen as just having the same capabilities. They're not giving any sort of like feminine exceptions. They're put to do the same work as men. They're seen as equal beasts of burden. Legal emancipation comes about. I'm fast forwarding very quickly. because there's hundreds of years in between the start of the slave trade and the end of slavery for the British and many other empires. But legal emancipation happens in the British Empire in 1834. In theory, it's supposed to bring liberation for all Black people. And in practice, it especially would retrench certain forms of servitude and inequality, especially for Black women, that they had already been suffering from pretty much since colonial slavery commenced in Antigua and the wider Americas. While Black men were supposed to be freed into the roles of breadwinners and heads of households, women were supposed to be released from bondage into nuclear families that were replete with submission to men through marriage and domestic responsibility for the home and for the care of children and elders. So the rest of my discussion today is going to focus on what the immediate aftermath of slavery brought for gender relations as they manifested themselves within Black working families in Antigua. And as noted in the intro, this is all based on my discussions in the 5th chapter of my book, Troubling Freedom. So, emancipation as a retrenchment of slavery's violence, okay? Black women and men throughout the Americas formed family through multiple intimate partnerships and extended kin networks since they arrived in the colonies in chains. As we know, another effect of slavery's violence was that non-monogamous and flexible partnerships prevailed in Black communities. These practices stemmed from African cultural antecedents, and they were also compounded by the fact of the frequency of death and the constant threat of sale in slave societies, which regularly disrupted family ties among Africans and their descendants. So you had to have a very capacious definition of who counted as your family and how you formed it when many people would come and go. Enslaved people always face the possibility of losing partners and children, as well as other loved ones through sale or death. And as I just mentioned, this rendered family ties extremely fragile. It also meant that enslaved people formed family when and how they could, given that no one could depend on lifelong stability and connections with the same people in the plantation context. That practice continues unabated even when slavery is legally outlawed in 1834. Informal unions and extended, often maternal-headed families, rather than patrilineal nuclear family formations, persisted well into the era of freedom. However, the powers that were in the new post-slavery order attempted in some ways to change how Black people formed family, labeling their non-monogamous, non-nuclear formations as quote-unquote adultery, and stigmatizing them for it. This especially led to Black women being disadvantaged as they tried to forge new lives after slavery. So the image I use here, this is an 1834 print by a British illustrator to commemorate abolition. And if you note, it places the adult Black man at the center and the women and the children at the side, actually pretty much beneath him. So that placement is is a really kind of glaring signal of the kinds of patterns that I trace in my chapter. So the 1834 British emancipation was really never designed to bring social or material advancement to any African descended Antiguans. The overall premise of my book is that freedom as defined by British colonial objectives of one, compliant productivity in the fields and in the home, and constant profits. That's just a troubling construct, hence the name Troubling Freedom. But also another level of troubling happens because newly freed Antiguans themselves had to disrupt this idea of British freedom. They had to trouble it in order to make their lives and livelihoods after slavery actually feel anything like real freedom. So my book's various chapters chart attempts by Black people to improve labor relations and their wages, to expand their social lives, to try to educate their children, to move off plantations and try to claim land and public and private spaces as their own. And at moments of particular tension, when they've met with so many obstacles in all of these other arenas, they rise up collectively or individually in defense of their rights. sometimes violently. Their acts of resistance don't always change their position. Most of the time, it doesn't change. It doesn't move them from the bottom of the colonial social hierarchy. But I insist, as a historian and as an educator in general, that tracing the history of failure among Black people who have, spent a lifetime, several lifetimes in, states of oppression is a really important, offers a really important set of lessons. Lacking success doesn't at all obscure the fact that they had desires, that they had a political agenda. That there are so many important lessons learned for us today, even in resistance that isn't successful, about how far we have come from these forms of degradation of 200 years ago, right? But another area that we need to concentrate on, besides those that I've already named, is on free people's intimate family and sexual relations after 1834, which are another important area for some very poignant lessons about the inequalities of emancipation. Namely, slavery's end would be particularly destabilizing for Black women in comparison to Black men. Black women, even though they're nominally freed by the 1834 decree, are not fully liberated. They would face physical subjugation and socioeconomic distress because their bodies, their relationships, and their livelihoods were subject to scrutiny and violence in many settings. Black women's plight and freedom would extend therefore that bodily devaluation and physical brutality that I talked about as being in place since the very beginnings during slavery as something that was perpetrated in many ways by both Black and white men, obviously in differing ways and in different points of social, sort of status, right? All of this would only intensify because after slavery, which is something else that I talk about in the book, Antigua's economic fortunes plummet. There's significant financial decline on the island as the sugar industry starts to tank in the decades after abolition. And I think, we have to understand that in times of crisis, violence against women only surges, which is a really scary lesson for the present. Scholars are sometimes reluctant to acknowledge the violation of Black women's bodily integrity by Black men under slavery, because in many ways it stemmed from what was a longstanding impulse, starting with the very beginnings of academic studies into Black history in the 1960s, that were born of social movements and this impulse to portray Black families as a refuge from white domination, understandably, right? And the push to sort of reprove the resilience of Black social ties despite the extremity of their oppression. I think as well, the silence about gendered fissures within Black families after freedom stems from very similar impulses. So we're worried about how the Black family looks in slavery and freedom, especially in an academy that is still overwhelmingly white, right? And how will the public discourse take these messages on and use them to prove, Black pathology? And I think all of that is valid criticism, but I think we have to be honest that if we fail to acknowledge the sometimes troubled relations between men and women in freedom, that we are distorting our understanding of the historically distinct gendered positions in society, right? And so with that, I'm going to move on to talking specifically about the role the Christian church plays in all of this history. So I'm going to present the Christian churches, as I do in my chapter, as a double-edged sword for freed women. As Christianity spreads throughout the Americas, European missionaries roundly would condemn what were common, culturally acceptable practices in Black communities, as I noted. In the British Caribbean colonies, freed people's increased membership after 1834 in Christian churches came about in some ways due to spiritual awakening, yes, but was as much, if not more, about the fact that churches provided social services that colonial governments and ex-slave owners would not. So schooling, the chance to move off of plantations and get into free villages, mutual benefit societies, which were dues-paying societies that were sort of like quasi-unions, because unions were, as a rule, illegal across the Caribbean until the 1940s. But in lieu of that, people paid dues to church societies that would offer death benefits and, illness benefits and things of that sort. Through People's Free Church membership, they had a number of privileges then, but also it had its detriments. A major one being that it brought forth new forms of interference with their informal, intimate relations. Clergymen tried but failed to dismantle fully this same flexibility in family formation that I have talked about that was prevalent among Africans and their descendants in Antigua and elsewhere in the region. But to a considerable degree, and often with very unhappy consequences, the churches did succeed in modifying the structures and lived experiences of family and sexuality for freed people. Free people in Antigua experienced in deeply gendered ways the pressures of dismal economic prospects as slavery ended. And they encountered the pressures of church-enforced monogamy. Men and women still jointly provided for their households, right? It's not like the church was doing everything for them. But women lost some of the independence that non-monogamy had afforded them once they joined the church, because the church sought to tether men and women together, right? And make women more dependent on their husband in more official and often repressive ways. So we have to understand that they largely would endorse the imperatives of the colonial state's emancipation program. So they had a vested interest in trying to refashion ex-slaves into willing sugar laborers and law-abiding subjects. So to that end, the churches would work alongside the state to focus on free people's sexual relations and marriages, or more often sexual relations outside of marriage. So they sought to restructure Black families by promoting wedlock, Christian wedlock, right? Getting married in the church, having a nuclear household, and submitting to patriarchal authority, that the head of that household should be the adult man, as opposed to female-headed extended family structures where, cousins and aunts and elders, grandparents, family play cousins would all be part of enslaved people's social worlds. So in my chapter, I drew on what were really just previously unstudied records of hundreds of Moravian church disciplinary proceedings in Antigua. I spent a few days in their archives in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and I was floored at how much these missionaries had recorded. I wished I could have stayed longer, although Bethlehem, Pennsylvania is not that exciting a place to be, so I did not stay longer. But while I was there, I'm talking about hundreds of proceedings that they would catalog into what they called adulterous relations. And from that, I gathered that emancipation was a gendered project that really just intensified these inequalities of slavery to which Black women were already subject. So in this section, the image that I'm using is actually the cover image from my book, because it's an 1832 watercolor of the churchyard of the Spring Gardens Moravian Church, which was done by a German painter who was visiting the island. And you can see Black devotees congregating in the churchyard. That tree is still there for those of you who are from Antigua and familiar with the church. And the churchyard doesn't look that different, actually. So in my book, I talk about the Moravian proceedings as a very kind of rare look into the everyday forms of family formation and intimacy among Antigua's newly freed population. The proceedings also, unfortunately, reveal the regularity of surveillance and physical assaults that are aimed at regulating freed women's bodies and their sexuality. And that's perpetuated jointly by Christian missionaries and by the Black women with whom they were intimate. Black women's bodies were constantly under duress. Legal abolition and the kinds of efforts that I talked about to expand freedom afterwards still generated little in the way of liberation for their bodies. In researching this issue, I used Moravian records because the Moravian Church boasted by far the greatest number of congregants from freed communities. Antigua also had two other major denominations of Christianity, Methodism and Anglicanism, but they held a lot less sway among the newly freed population. So to understand how the majority of freed people lived and loved is to explore the social side of Moravianism. The popularity of Moravianism is not because it had any kind of distinct set of doctrines and practices that were liberatory, but ironically because this was the planters' preference in the West Indies. And the pro-slavery advocates in London to which the planters on the island were reporting. So I'll give you some more details. The Methodist and Moravian churches actually held very similar views on the baseline equality in theory of all human beings. But those messages were definitely subdued in the other messaging, in relation to the other messaging that was trying to get, sort of these churches ingratiated with the colonial plantocracy. So the idea that, submissiveness needed to be encouraged, obedience, and, sort of a kind of satisfaction with their earthly lot is true of pretty much all the Christian churches on the island. However, the structure of each church differed. The Methodists in particular offered avenues to lay leadership for anyone who was educated enough and well-versed enough in the Bible. So mixed race and free Black believers could and did become lay leaders in the church in Antigua. And that made them appear much more politically dangerous to the planters and fostered their greater support in turn for the Moravian presence. And Methodism actually had a very mixed cohort in Antigua. Certain white congregants were flocking to the church because it had an association with respected planter families, like the Gilberts, who helped to bring Methodism to the island around 1760. On the flip side, Anglicans only really started to care about baptizing slaves around the 1820s, which was coincident with Parliament's encouragement to sort of improve the lives of slaves. For those of you well-versed in the history of British emancipation, there's these regulations in 1823 called the amelioration doctrines that are passed from Parliament to the colonies. And it's because they want to improve slavery because too many infractions have been happening. In the same year, there was a massive uprising in what is now Guyana. At the time, the region is known as Demerara. And the Demerara uprising scares the living daylights out of Parliament because Guyana is one of their biggest colonies and one of their most lucrative. So when this massive disorder with all these, slave leaders happens and it's tied to the slave leadership, that is an avenue through certain types of dissenter church proselytizing. So the Baptists are sort of especially implicated in that uprising. Basically, every church that is not Anglican is called a dissenter church in the British Empire. So all those churches became suspect after a while, especially the ones that pushed enslaved people and Black people in general to be leaders and thinkers about church doctrine. So the Anglicans are like, you know what, we need to get in front of this and start baptizing people ourselves who are Black. But we're going to do it in still very unequal ways. There's going to be no lay leadership. There's going to be no ideas about equality that are pushed to the population. The Anglicans are the British state church, and they have a long association with the white establishment. And they had some limited outreach, sure, with soup kitchens, with schools, but Anglicanism is still very much an overwhelmingly white church in post-slavery Antigua. After 1834, the Moravians would continue to attract the greatest number of Black working class worshipers, and unlike the other two denominations, they counted its missionaries and their families as the only white believers in Antigua. So you have to see the Moravian Church as literally a mirror of the colonial state or plantation itself, because a small number of mostly foreign whites, because the Moravian Church actually just is a sect founded in East Germany, but nobody in Germany is actually Moravian. The Moravians dedicated their entire, sort of like church agenda to baptizing the heathens. So they went everywhere else in the world that they thought heathens existed. So they have a large presence in Africa, in the US South, and in the West Indies. Fun fact, if you ever heard of the Bank Wachovia in North Carolina, it descended from the Wachovia settlements in the area that were built by the Moravians to intrude on the Native and Black communities there. So yeah, there's a lot of ties to slavery. Moravians definitely own slaves. There's no question that they're not the most progressive communion. But again, they're just seen as a safe space for planters. They pushed compliance, so they were welcomed. Okay, so now let's get into the meat of what happens with Moravian intrusions into newly freed people's lives. So the Moravian Church fought against non-marital sexual relations among congregants through its very, sort of detailed system of church discipline. And the system had mixed results. However, the church was determined to persist in this practice regardless of said mixed results. And the review process, which the Moravians termed conferences, largely unfolded from what they thought were adulterous offenses. And by Moravian definition, anything that was involving cohabitation and sexual intimacy without marriage was adulterous. And certainly the inevitable pregnancies that resulted were, sort of the most sinful effects of these offenses. Clergy often called these relations between men and women outside of marriage, quote, sinful connections. And the sinful connections the clergy found in this sort of multiple partner structure of Black families shows that freed people balanced their performance of Christianity with the maintenance of unorthodox social formations that they always held in private. They were never fully converted, and that's something you need to understand, right? So exclusions could result actually from the fact of these sorts of, unapproved sexual, kinds of connections. They could also exclude you from the church because of other unsavory forms of public comportment. So if you practice obia, which I talked about in that chapter, if you practiced public drunkenness, if you were known to use foul language in public, if you attended parties that were deemed illicit because lewd conduct was assumed to have occurred there. I mean, basically any kind of fun. Anything fun, and imagine you've been a slave for most of your lifetime, and now you just want to go and relax on the weekend and have a drink and go to a party, and now you might get thrown out of the church for that, right? So those are all offenses that were seen as worthy of being, excluded. But the overwhelming majority of offenses that I saw in the Moravian records pertained to offenses around illicit sex and non-monogamous relations. The entire process shames Black men and women for their social habits and places them in this kind of suppliant position before church authority begging for readmission. The procedure requires freed people to not only expose intimate details of their private lives for clergy's scrutiny, but again, to sort of, plead to be readmitted to the community, which is another extension of the relations of power that were already at work between freed people and the church. So the process of exclusion is very prolonged. And see, I've already passed by a couple of those bullet points. So the procedure requires freed people not only to expose intimate details of their private lives, but then they are warned first once they share what they did. After the warning, if they get brought back in, they might get prevented from enjoying various privileges within the church. They might not be allowed to receive communion. They might not be allowed to attend mass on certain days. Then there would be the final form of punishment, which would be full exclusion, where you're kept from all church activities and you're removed from the community. A congregant who repented and reformed themselves. And how do you reform yourself? I don't know. You have to prove that you're following the rules. And you could slip up one day, and then what, right? But if you repent and you reform yourself, you could be readmitted after spending weeks, months, or maybe even years outside of the church community. But in some cases, exclusion resulted in a permanent severing of all ties. Exclusion from the church carried not only social but material consequences. So you could be denied the opportunities to school yourself or your children, because churches had schools, Sunday schools and night schools that accommodated the schedules of plantation laborers in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, when people were coming out of slavery without much schooling at all. They were not literate. So the path to literacy often was routed through the Bible. But having some literacy meant that you had a little bit more power in society. So preventing people from attending school is a real blow. Losing the benefits you might have paid into the friendly society, right? You're banking on getting the money when you might get sick or you might have some kind of other problem or somebody in your family dies, you have to pay for a funeral. You could even be expelled from the free villages. And the Moravian Church was one of the first and most vociferous advocates for the creation of what are known in Antigua as free villages. Because once you're enslaved and you're moved into freedom and you can't actually leave the jobs that you're in, you also have trouble leaving the homes that you occupied. So a lot of people in the immediate decades after slavery lived in slave housing. There was nowhere else for them to go. It's a small island. There's like, 35,000 people in about 150 plantations. Everybody is working on one or more of those plantations. And so to be able to find a place to, kind of plot yourself into a space that is your own so that your job isn't tied to your ability to have a home is actually really important. Because if you get fired, you can go find somewhere else to work without having to also find somewhere else to live. So Moravians did a lot of work of advocating for the rights to certain land, creating free villages on plots of land they had already built churches and schools on, and also any plantations that had fallen into debt, they would often purchase and then rent out lots to newly freed people so that they could actually build their own homes. So free villages meant a lot to people. That was definitely a move toward feeling free. So I began this section with this image. This is an image of just the hut of somebody who is, a free woman in post-slavery, in the post-slavery Dominican Republic. This is in the 1840s. And this is the kind of typical household that, Black enslaved and free people all over the Caribbean would have inhabited. If you notice, there's a garden, I don't know where you have the your actual images, but hopefully if you move them to the top, you get the images of our faces. You can see some of the work, like women on the side doing wash, bringing gourds of water to somewhere. Those kinds of images show you just the everyday life that can happen when you have your own private space to speak of, where you can actually care for yourselves and your family, and you're not just at the disposal of the people who once owned you. So, being told that you had run afoul of church rules had serious material, financial consequences as well as social consequences. And the overwhelming majority of the investigations into the sinful connections, as well as a range of these other transgressions, resulted from information provided to the clergy by someone known as a helper. Helpers were male and or female lay, persons who Moravian missionaries had appointed to assist them in their outreach to local congregations in their foreign missions. And they were seen as, sort of able to be helpers because they were credible in their communities. The records aren't consistent, but I see where often female helpers advocated for women when they faced exclusion or accused others of exclusion-worthy offenses. Helpers, though, were not just advocates, they were also, spies. They conducted surveillance. They gave missionaries extensive knowledge of what was going on in the social worlds of the congregation. So the Moravians functioned like the plantation and the colonial state, again, because they also used local people as middlemen to implement their will and intricately use those people to intricately document their subjects in ways that allowed condemnation and potential transformation of their social habits. So in Antigua and throughout the Moravian missions in the Caribbean, helpers were very well positioned to identify free people who committed the acts that qualified as misconduct. And so they had respect, sure, but there were also many moments where Black Moravians showed their ultimate dislike of the helpers in their congregation. So the helper office and this constant threat of exclusions within the Moravian church structures just created an atmosphere of suspicion within the congregation. So the records I looked at showed that people in the church often used this system to retaliate against their personal enemies and to regulate community relations more broadly. So people could just denounce you to the church as a way to get back at you for something else. Maybe you didn't even do what they're saying you did. But more importantly, though, the exclusion process exposed the extent of Black women's vulnerability after slavery. Proceedings regulating these quote unquote sinful connections often found Black women caught between the impossibility of upholding church standards for sex and marriage in their community and the difficulty of preserving their self-interest and quite often their safety in the context of their ongoing non-monogamy with men. Married women in Antigua endured a considerable level of anxiety because of the church constantly condemning adultery and their heightened competition with other women and the relentless abuse that they would suffer from their partners as a result. A couple of cases that I raise in the chapter also show that freedom fosters new economic opportunities for acquiring wages, but at the same time also places new strains on working men and women. So you get into a free village, you build a new home, you've got to furnish it, you've got to put food in it, you've got to, provide for a domestic life. Your income has to stretch much further than whatever money you were garnering through, slavery's independent side work allowances, right? Where you still have rations of food and clothing from your owners. At the rare moments where the wages paid on sugar estates rose, there's still a struggle among freed people to make their ends meet. But a lot of the times, the wages in post-slavery Antigua were dipping because sugar just was not doing well. Quite frankly, the British sugar islands were competing against places like Cuba and Brazil that still had slavery, and they still weren't paying for their labor. So that sugar was way cheaper. And so the British just couldn't keep up. British owners of plantations were just trying to make up the difference by, paying a pittance. Snippets of information in passing in these records of Moravian church and actually also in the courts for the magistrates suggest that these kinds of financial difficulties, again, had gendered consequences. The same thing I was saying in the beginning of the talk, that when the economy goes bad, the consequences for women are dire. And so there's a lot of fragmentary but very loaded details in the records that show that there is, kind of unstable combination of freed women trying to adopt problematic and sometimes damaging strategies and the material cost of their attempting to be monogamous. So intimate relations are flexible, but the church has these sort of very serious strictures regarding marriage. And in the collision between the two, women get the short end of the stick. Multiple partnerships and extended family structures enable free people to get and preserve resources just as much as male-dominated nuclear families, a fact that missionaries fail to recognize. but the women who continued to act upon the assumption of flexible domesticity were subject to censure from their husbands and the church. Sometimes the women who are petitioning are reporting that they are suspected, they're receiving extreme forms of violence from the men in their families because they are reporting the men to the church. And the church ignores it. They ignore the extreme violence, and they're just really showing, the church shows that they think Black women's bodies are ultimately disposable, and that the coercion that they're subject to by Black men and sometimes even other Black women are, sort of just as okay as, as long as everybody follows the church rules. So these cases are really less concerned with ensuring Black women's safety than with enforcing Black women's adherence to these unequal conventions of gender embedded in the rules of their faith. So I don't want to give specifics here because I'm already way over time. But if you've read the chapter, I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of the specific cases that I lay out. So just wanted to end with some thoughts. And basically the thoughts are that freedom is a constant struggle. As I was saying in the beginning, that's sort of the lesson to be taken from every bit of the book, that there is nothing that guarantees Black people's freedom in this period. Even their own work with their own hands may not always be enough, right? I'm closing here with an image that's popularized in the transatlantic British abolition movement. It's a feminization of what is an archetypal image that was used in the movement of a male slave begging for freedom under the title, Am I Not a Man and a Brother? And they put women into the image, and put it as, Am I Not a Woman and a Sister? As a way for white abolitionist women to argue that, they had a very particular role in understanding and advocating for Black enslaved women to be freed, because they know the specifics of gendered inequality. Some women in the abolitionist movement were really using abolitionism as a stepping stone to having a public life. They weren't quite invested in Black equality as much as they were invested in their own careers, but at least they raised the question. The question being, to whom are Black women pleading for freedom? In light of the discussion, in light of my chapter, I don't know. I would love to hear your thoughts. We should consider that Christian churches, again, were just this place of contradictory significance. They offered civic and material support, but they also offered intense scrutiny and regulation of these communities and of Black women's bodies. The archive is hostile. It can't capture the fullness of Black people's lives, but it's some of the richest evidence I've seen of ordinary, everyday interactions shaping the experience of freedom. And the records are startling. They're unsettling, because there's these really competing notions of what family form should look like, that are visible between what Black communities think and what the church thinks, what white colonial authorities think. And sometimes the women that try to adopt these rules are subject to the violence from men, trying to assert their authority over women, over and above what church authority says. And women trying to seek to protect themselves physically and economically aren't doing so successfully. But yet, I think all of this is also just a sign that, the order was not ever tidy. The order is always unstable. The church wanted control, they did not have it. Clearly, people were just constantly coming in for conferences. If the order was working, there would be no need for them, right? So ultimately, the end of legal enslavement in Antigua threw Black women and men into a network of all kinds of unfreedoms, even after slavery. Unfreedoms from their families and their social relations, limits to their autonomy, and limits to their ability to get support from their social and spiritual communities. And I just want to end again with the point that I don't want to see, sort of this, I don't want us to see this violence that I talk about as a kind of matter of individual pathology, right? Like, it's not just Black women sort of in every case just happening to choose the wrong man. And then in every case, Black men have this inherent push toward violence. I think it's critical to kind of understand and frame this violence as a consequence of certain structures of ongoing inequality that begin again with Britain's colonial enterprise from its start as an enterprise that devalued Black women physically and ideologically. Um, and that through line continues from slavery into free labor and into the Christian church and the institution of marriage that it's putting forth. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for listening. I would love to hear from you all about your thoughts on what you read, and certain any questions that you may have from me. I'm happy to answer them about what I did, what I what I maybe didn't do. But again, thank you so much just for sticking with me for this long. So, Sarah, I don't know if this is where you might take over. If anybody has questions, I would love for somebody to just, if you guys have any questions, to raise your hands. And if maybe Sarah or Lucia, if you can just pay, close attention to who's raising their hands, to, let me know who to pitch to. Yeah.
Nicole has their hand up.
Okay. Oops. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for this. This was really, really interesting, and I feel like I could listen to this for hours. So thank you so much for sharing your work. I'm really interested in your methodology and how you approach your research. In general, or whatever you want to share. I'm very grateful and curious to know.
Okay, so I'll tell you that a good portion of my method and the work that I did, I began with just, just looking in everything on post Antigua. And so I went to, various archives and just collected everything. I just took pictures as much as possible. I have probably used about a quarter of all the stuff that I actually collected. That being said, though, I want to suggest, and I think I'm sort of in line with, and yet a slight departure from, the work of historians of slavery. Black feminist historians of slavery in particular talk a lot about the history of, silences and archival, sort of insufficiency when it comes to talking about the ways that enslaved people, and especially enslaved women, lived and labored and protected themselves, right? I think I share with them the suspicion of the archive fully. But what happens is my archive, it's full of abundance. It's not an archive of silence and, like small bits and pieces. Like I said, the Moravian church records, it was just all this stuff. And the same thing is true with the British National Archives and the correspondence that's taking place after the end of slavery. There's a lot of writing, a lot of note taking. The colonial enterprise was full of all of this anxiety around trying to figure out what are Black people doing right after slavery, and will they maintain order? Will they continue to do what we need them to do to keep the profits up? And so I share with the feminists, the Black feminist, sort of I would say there's an intervention. It's a massive intervention into how we talk about slavery in, the Western Hemisphere at this point, because of the questions raised by people like, Jennifer Morgan, Saidiya Hartman, Marisa Fuentes, and the list goes on. And these are all people I count as colleagues, people who I worked alongside, who've mentored me, et cetera, and whose work I teach and read regularly. But in the emancipation moment, the immediate post-emancipation moment, there is just it's not about like a throwaway line in a full ledger. It's like the whole ledger might be dedicated to writing about, what are freed people doing. The problem is that white people don't ever know what Black people are doing, not fully. You know what I mean? So part of my method is a healthy amount of suspicion. And so almost everything that I did involved, to your point, Nicole, about method, I spent a lot of time be constantly basically turning the archive inside out, trying to constantly see Black people's desires, wants, their methods for protecting themselves and attempting to procure freedom in every form by looking at the things that made white people upset the most. Everything that made white people anxious, uncomfortable, everything they passed a law against, everything that they tried to do to regulate what freed people were going to do, everything that sort of looked like any kind of work to undermine the society that they had imagined of, a return to the order of slavery with freedom in name only. As soon as anybody ran afoul of the order, I was like, okay, that's it. That's it. That's exactly where you can find the story of what Black people's ideas about freedom really were. So I use Black people's practices to read backward into what might have been a political agenda. And I actually, funny enough, I'll just say one last thing about this method. So I worked with a developmental editor on my manuscript. Besides the press, I paid somebody because I needed someone to read this thing alongside me because I had spent so much time with it, right? The very first beginnings of this book go back to a paper in a graduate class that I had taken with the person who ended up supervising my dissertation, Ada Ferrer. And she's, her class was, kind of the place where I first got to explore some of these histories I was very interested in. And that was in like 2002, right? And the book came out in 2015. So, it was a long time where I was just in this book. And so I was so steeped in it, I couldn't figure out like sometimes how to make my points clear anymore because I just knew it too well. So my developmental editor would read my sentences and she would say, "You are writing some really funny sentences. Your sentence structure is weird. What's going on here?" And I was like, "Oh, the biggest problem is," and she said, she started to diagnose it. She was like, you would start with Black people and kind of take a through line through what white people said and end up back at Black people. And she was like, "What is happening here?" And I had to tell her, the problem is that I've read too many books about slavery and freedom that say they're about the Black people at the center of the process and end up being about white people and what white people said about what was going on. And I didn't want to discount the fact that my book was based entirely on mostly white written sources because Black people didn't write. They were semi-literate, sometimes mostly illiterate. So I didn't want to not acknowledge where I got this stuff from, but at the same time, I wanted Black people to be the subject of every one of my sentences as much as possible. So just down to even the writing, I was very deliberate. And that was, part of the method. And I had to actually be encouraged by my developmental editor to just let it go, let the white people go, leave them in the footnotes and just, make the sentences about Black people and just be okay with that. So I hope that answers your questions about method. There's a lot more that I could say about this, but that's kind of the baseline. The starting point is I believe Black people at every turn. So that's what informed the way that I structured this book and the way that I approached the archives that sort of underwrite it.
All right.
So who's
we
next?
have Jackie, then Asheen, then Shade.
Okay.
Hi,
Jackie.
Hi everyone. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Sarah and Intersect, because this is actually I'm in a doctoral program and this is one of my exam texts, and I actually wrote about your text, Dr. Lightfoot, in my answer to Dr. Aisha Finch's question for my exam.
Aisha was in grad school with me, and she also was one of Ada students. I love this.
Yeah, and I selected this chapter specifically too for many reasons. And so I do I have two questions. One I'm a bit more insecure to ask about than the other, but for me too, your text touches on a lot of the Black feminist historianship that I'd been reading. And I find it very interesting that to just go to further expound on the method question from Nicole, I just found it very interesting that you zoom into the quotidian, that's your focus to make sense of freedom. You're zooming into the quotidian. And I actually find that to be a really interesting thing when I read Black queer scholarship. Sexuality and temporality come together in the quotidian. So like I love reading your book with Jafari Allen's There's a Disco Ball Between Us, where he's,
Jafari.
yeah, he's digging, very, specifically on moment by moment, things. So one of my original questions were, how do you feel you are in relationship to the Black feminist historiography? So you very much answered that, but I also, another question I had is, you also very clearly, so I have to come out as somebody of Jamaican heritage, and you very throughout the text, you refer to Antigua's size, and so I'm curious about whether you would whether you would hope for any specific ethics for people who are coming from larger places. And so I was born and raised in the South, so who are dealing with these same constellations of dynamics, but who are coming from larger places. I see you really, you know, gesturing at, you know, there's a correct way to come like to this space. Don't just assume, blackness, Black woman, but like also size is key to this. So that's one thing. And then on the other hand, as you mentioned with Black feminist study, I'm curious if you might approach, for those of us who might want to read your text with Black queer scholarship, do you feel like that's appropriate? Or if so, how were you even intentionally, contributing anything
Right.
or to conversations in Black queer scholarship? And then the last thing I just wanted to say is, in speaking on absences, something about your methodology made it really clear to me how surveillance materials can be used across our studies, across time, and just how much is there. It made things a little less scary for me to be existing in this world where it feels like so much is surveilled. So
Yes.
that's
Okay.
it.
That's a lot. Thank you so much, though. I appreciate it. Oh, and also the chat is happening too. I think, okay. Oh, yes. Daryl, I wanted to say hi to people I know in the audience, mind you. And I want to say hello, first of all, to the person I've known the longest in the audience. Hi, Serene. Serene and I go back basically to childhood. And she's an amazing mental health specialist, active between Antigua and New York City. And so love you so much. Hope you, your sister, your mom, everybody's doing well. Hi, Daryl, my former student. At Columbia, who is, a brilliant undergraduate and hopefully soon to be a graduate student, who took a class with me last semester on the Black Atlantic. Hi to Sade, who is like, a friend that I met through the now defunct Clubhouse that existed back when we were all locked inside. Thanks to everybody for coming out, but I especially felt like I needed to mention everybody in the room that I knew personally, and thank them for coming. Okay, so now to get to the meat of all of your questions. Smallness. As I'm going to start there, and that because the first question of like, I think I would start there because in some ways it's about me being very intentional about saying like, something about Antigua's size and the sort of like the violence of that intimacy, the fact that there is nowhere to go, that you can't, that after a certain point you just have to get off the island, is important to talk about. There's nowhere to retreat into. There's no like marinage is not quite a thing after a certain point because the entirety of the island is carved up into plantations and much of it is flat. So there's not really a chance to sort of, you know, put yourself in a place that is like remote. You can't, the most you can do is hide in plain sight if you can do it. And so that lack of extra space means a certain level of constraint, a certain level of familiarity that even the colonial authorities have in believing that, oh, there's just certain things that are impossible to happen here. Because we have these people under control. We've got the land sewed up. We've got the job sewed up. Like there's a way that I think some of this looks similar in other larger places like a Jamaica, like a Cuba, like a DR, or even like the US South. But then there's still like spaces of retreat that I feel like aren't there in the same way in these smaller islands. I think, you know, similarly, a place like Barbados would be like similar. You know, places like this where every bit of land has already been claimed. And so you're either renting from somebody white or you buying from somebody white. You know what I'm saying? So like, I just feel like starting from that and being able to see how even with that lack of sort of spatial vastness, that's still like other form of opposition that can be traced. And I think that blends into my interest in the everyday as this site of resistance. I'm especially excited about talking about how everybody did a little bit of something to trouble the order every day. Because I also realized that in a lot of these bigger places, you have like these massive uprisings that can happen because there's places of remoteness to plan. You know, and there's places where, you know, those types of places, like I think about Jamaica, like most of the 18th century, Jamaica enslaved people are just like giving the British hell. And I love that. I teach that. You know, I think that history is so incredibly fascinating. Antigua's history doesn't look like that, right? But even though they're not always lighting stuff on fire, there's still a certain type of oppositional spirit that can be traced through how everybody lived there every day. And what I think is translatable then from that, and I feel like you see it in Aisha Finch's work as well, which I teach too, this idea that like, if we see kind of per Saidiya Hartman, this like archetypal slave as a man who is lighting something on fire, a slave resistor out front as the kind of person who is, you know, always kind of male coded, then you miss how enslaved women's resistance looks. You miss how freed women's resistance looks on a sort of more everyday in the home, you know, sort of smaller acts, you know, small acts chopping down big trees, right? Like it's just, you have to have this understanding that everything kind of builds. And I think that's what makes maybe what bits of my work might be translatable to the spaces of research that are, you know, larger, because I still feel like there's a method in sort of zooming in, as you noted, on like not just the spatial size, but also the sort of what's at least purportedly insignificant, the sort of the smallness of the everyday, and how much that site is still quite a robust site for tracing, you know, a pushback on the order. Now, as for queer scholarship, I can't make any claims to sort of being someone who knows queer scholarship well, right? Like that my training was definitely in, you know, like I was trained as a historian of the Caribbean, with reference to the African diaspora, slavery, emancipation, like the very political and social, old school social histories, in a way that makes like queer scholarship fantastic and almost like a world apart from me, because they ask questions that a lot of the time the obsessions of like, you know, 19th century scholars just, there's not as the same kind of room for, or at least there wasn't in my training. Maybe those who are getting trained now, there's more room for that, is what I'm telling you. Like 20 years ago, it just didn't enter into even what I was trained in. So I couldn't make claims to that. At the same time, do I feel like I have like a community with queer scholars of the African diaspora? I think yes. I think so. And Ngozi, your point about mentioning non-monogamous relationships, yes. I think the fact that if we're taking the idea of queerness to some of its larger, more, sort of like the kinds of significances where we understand queerness as heterodox, as troubling the order, in many ways, Black family formation and this idea of rejecting, Christian marriage, rejecting, the ways that people come, that the ways that, sort of white people want Black people to come together as a part of the story of, uh, of of Blackness and its relationship to queerness historically, I would say yes. I'm fully in conversation. I would be honored to be in conversation with people like Jafari Allen. I think his work is incredible. He's also a colleague of mine at Columbia. And I read There's a Disco Ball Between Us before he got hired and thought, like, this is it's some of the most incredible writing I've ever taken in, just across the boards, in any form of scholarship. So the fact that you're seeing me as being in conversation with him, thank you. Now, as for the stuff around absences and how not to be scared of them, I can tell you when I first started, the people who worked on Antigua told me, you're not gonna find a thing. They told me to expect the archives to not tell you a thing. And I thought, oh God, all right, well, I guess I'm gonna still go, and see what I find. And then I realized I had to be okay with the fact that I was dealing with stuff that on its face did not look like useful stuff. It's just when you're looking at a bunch of German missionaries or some really angry, white guy in the parish of St. Peter parish whose plantation is falling into debt. It doesn't look quite on its face like something I'm going to be able to use. And yet they're all mad about what Black people are doing and what they're not doing in the right way. So how can you not make note of that and realize, as it keeps happening, that this is a dialogue, this is a pattern, this is a narrative of what the end of slavery looked like, and you could tell the story of the end of slavery as white people won. They won until independence. I mean, you know what I'm saying? There's a way that you can tell the story differently, but if you tell the story like that, you miss a lot. Is what I'm saying. Even though the white, yes, they win over and over again, sure. But on the way to a loss, Black people raised hell. And I love that for us. And so that's what I wanted to write. So thank you for your many questions. I hope that I answered them well. And certainly you can, ask me more, email me. Good luck with your exams. I hated exam prep, but I think in one last thing I'll tell you, that I told Sarah, I told a couple of people who, prep for exams either with me or I knew them while they were doing it. And I just said, look, once you've taken classes, in many ways, you can answer these questions. You can already pass your exams. You've already prepared, you've already gotten the tutelage, you know what this is, you can answer these questions, you'll be fine. Just the caliber of the questions you ask me tells me you'll be fine. Good luck. All right, who's next?
Okay, I just want to do some housekeeping. So we are at 6:28, and so we'll take these last 4 questions, but please keep your questions very brief because we do want to end in a timely fashion. So I think we have Sade. Please correct me on the pronunciation of your name, then Patrice, then Daryl, then Asheen.
Sade, very close. Thank you. Hey, Natasha. For those of you who don't know me, I'm based in New York, born and raised in New York, Antiguan descent. And Natasha, my question is around documentation of people as it pertains to lineage in the context of a small place. And you and I have talked about this offline, but for context, everyone, as I mentioned, I was born in New York, Antiguan descent, and I currently hold dual citizenship, but getting dual citizenship was quite the hurdle because family members were born in these sinful states, as Natasha was talking about. I know that's not unique circumstances, but in trying to get proper documentation I realized that a lot of tracing family in our stories is like oral history. Things aren't written down. And in a small place like Antigua, there's this reliance on other knowing everyone's business, right? Everyone knows everyone. Why would I have to write this down? Why would I need documentation? We all just know. But when it comes to legitimacy, it becomes difficult. So curious, my question is, Natasha, like how within the context of Antigua post-emancipation and the idea of like non-monogamous relationships, how has that impacted documentation? And how would you recommend people today to really trace their lineage and get a hold of documentation from then to present day?
Yeah, good question. But I want to hear everybody's question, but yes, a lot there. Who's next? Who's next?
Yeah, I was next. I just wanted to express the appreciation for naming. You talked about it being silent, the misogyny Black women experience under slavery, and how the enslaved person is seen as a man fighting for freedom in very specific ways, and how women's oppression at the hands of Black men is silenced for many reasons, that is inconvenient in some ways. And then ways of resistance are considered to be you have to burn something down for your resistance to be valid. And I remember one story from a scholar of Atlantic slavery. I can't remember, it might have been Stella Dadsey, I'm not certain, but the scholar talked about how a, an enslaved woman working inside the house resisted by simply doing the shutters wrong for the entire morning. She was considered to be stupid, of course. So she just pretended to be stupid and she just couldn't get it right. So she squandered an entire morning of work by just doing the shutters wrong and not understanding and pushing them up and pushing them down and then looking doe-eyed at the enslavers like, well, I just can't understand. And so we're missing those ways of resistance. We're not talking enough about the casual misogyny that is experienced in Pan-African spaces. So yeah, those tensions where Black men being at the position of being able to be both oppressed and oppressor,
Yeah.
and which identity they adopt sometimes conveniently. So I'm reflecting on all of that right now. And that woman, I just thought she was just so funny and clever. She just played around with these shades all morning and squandered the morning away. And she didn't burn anything down, but she made a small difference.
Absolutely. Yeah. Hope I get to it.
Oh, so if you had any more, I don't know if you came, the question would be if you had any more of those examples where those small acts of annoying, pestering resistance that you came across in your research.
Yes, I will. I'll share. Who's next?
Daryl, you're next.
Okay. Hello, Professor Lightfoot. So my question, it's not as academic as everyone else's, but I'm still interested. Uh, I know we talk about a lot about like how we resisted the subtle ways. In this particular situation, women were resistant. The past couple of semesters, like here on campus especially, and just being in this environment that I'm in, this is a new environment for me. Um, I had to, so one situation, like with the security here on campus, like I found myself having to, and I say this with I say this humbly, but I found myself having to assert a certain type of dominance to like, yo, bro, like I'm not the one to be playing with. And that works. Like that works. Like they don't ask me for my idea anymore. And for the past few months, I'm like, yo, bro, like I have a little bit more breathing room because they don't bother me anymore. Like I've barked at enough of them to where they don't bother me. But now when I'm with my homegirls on campus, like I don't, it's almost like they try to bully women. And Dr. Lightfoot, like you've known me for a little bit. Like you're not gonna do that in front of me, bro. Like you're not gonna do that in front of me. But I wonder, like, when I'm not with my homegirls and a security say something to them, I immediately saying things to them that I definitely would not repeat here. And it works. Like they calm down. So I wonder, but then I think about when I'm not with my homegirls here on campus, like what are they going through? Who's trying to bully them? And if I have to like create these forms of resistance today on campus, and that's just one way that I resist what's going on here. There's a couple other things. Like I wonder, like my question is like, how do you as a woman, like what type of forms of resistance you practice that we don't necessarily see like out like every day?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I will answer that as best I can. Okay. And the last person who has their hand raised, thank you for your questions, everybody, so far, is Asheen. Is that it?
Asheen, are you there? Can you unmute? Okay, I think their hand is down. Maybe when they come back, they can put it in the chat.
Yes. Good night.
Hi.
Can everybody hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
All right. A couple things. First of all, I am not in the academic arena. I have a sister, Crystal Joseph. She's on the chat. She saw that Intersect Antigua was having this discussion, and she thought it was something that I would be interested in. I'm very grateful to be a part of this chat, to be a part of this discussion. I live in Antigua. I'm a lawyer that's been practicing for over 20 years. And this discussion has had a huge impact because, one, I'm a Christian. College institution. I also studied history at the University of the West Indies, and I have never seen scholarship so in depth when it comes to Antiguan history. I studied history over 20 years ago, and I've never seen such precise information that goes in that's so deep. And seeing this, I have a bittersweet feeling because I'm not sure if there's any other books. I'm going to now go out of my way to look for other books. Professor Lightfoot. And also to echo a question that had been put earlier, the major reason why I decided to speak up is because I live in Antigua and I know how difficult it is to get information from the archives. And it makes me sad to hear that all of this information on Antiguans is in Pennsylvania, is in the United States. I've also been a part of other societies, and I understand that there's a lot of information with respect to the reparations movement that is in England. And I keep asking myself why, as an ordinary Antiguan, I cannot get easy access to all of this information that pretty much explains why we as a people live the way that we live. I just want to make one last comment. I listened to everything that was said, and I realized that pretty much, Dr. Lightfoot, you have pretty much explained why Antiguan society operates the way that it does today in 2025. You have pretty much explained why there's so many of us, in our 40s or 50s asking ourselves, why did our parents, our grandparents, acted in a particular manner? And hearing about the censor that, the churches had, that grip that they had on social life, social culture in Antigua, you more or less explained why we are the way we are. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. And also just, if you could give a little bit more information as to how you accessed whatever information that you had in Antigua.
Okay. So I actually might take Sade and Asheen's questions together, given the closeness of the subject matter of the two. So to start with this question of how documentation is very much lacking, um, ultimately, Sade is absolutely right. There is just a kind of informality and an under documentation that is happening in terms of what because of all of these informal ways that family were formed. There was a kind of rejection of, for instance, if you were born out of wedlock, your birth certificate was registered under your mother's name. No father was put on the birth certificate by practice as a matter of legal practice. In churches, you were baptized on a different day if you were born out of wedlock. There's a whole understanding of, right, and the lack of surnames. Like, you would have your mother's surname, technically. That's the only surname you could search. So even if you know that you were born to, a father named, Lightfoot, it doesn't matter if, Lightfoot wasn't married to my mother, then, at that point in the night, going up to the 1940s, 50s, 60s, right? Like well into the 20th century, you're going to find that the only way to trace ancestry is through, as Sade noted, oral history, and that everybody knows everybody. It's interesting that you mentioned that, because my mother is the kind of person who is like a walking genealogist. In Antigua, if you tell her a surname, she is going to tell you, as long as you can give her a surname and a parish, exactly who you come from, where in the village your people lived, what so and so did for a living, how so and so might have worked with one of my aunts at Liat or something. You know what I mean? Like, it's just a whole rundown, right? And so oftentimes, that's the way that people kind of were their own walking documentation. The problem is that when those people die, the stories die with them. I actually found out today about a young woman in Antigua who I believe is surnamed McMaster. So I just realized she's probably part of the Susie's hot sauce family. Again, being like my mom, I learned these things, where you can identify family names with their businesses, etc. And so this young woman, her name is Chelsea McMaster, and she won a Fulbright, and she's supposed to be conducting an oral history project in Antigua around the pottery traditions in Seaview Farm that go back about like 2 centuries, right? And I'm excited. I want to meet her. I just saw it in the paper when I was reading the paper today, and I was like, oh, look at this. More people are interested. We need people to write things down desperately. We need more oral historians. Everybody has a computer in their pocket. There is a microphone app. Please take this down, because the problem is that when elders die, all of the information dies with them. And that is the only way you're going to be able to trace your family history. Because, people don't even know their real names. We could start there. Like, a lot of people don't find out their real names until someone dies, someone needs a passport, someone tries to buy a piece of land or something like that, and they need their government name. And that's when they realize their whole life they've been going by what was a nickname. So yes, all of that impacts documentation. On a broader level, though, to go to Asheen's question about what happens then on the issues of Antigua and the Caribbean's, sort of eligibility for reparatory justice when all of the records are elsewhere, they are working, right? Like, there's a CARICOM Reparations Commission. Every island has a member commission. I'm, sort of informally part of Antigua's and Barbuda's Reparations Commission that reports to CARICOM because of the knowledge that I have, right? The point that you're raising is such a huge one, that there is all this documentation elsewhere. Some of it's in parts of the United States, some of it's in Canada, some of it's in the UK. It's everywhere that our various colonizers resided, right? And so that's actually a part that literally the lack of documentation sitting on the island is a reparatory justice issue. And I know that there are other islands that have fought for the repatriation of their records at points, but I also want to say on the flip side, because I've done some work in preservation and I've seen the like ongoing issues with regard to climate change and lack of budgets to properly preserve the historical records. The archives in Antigua has so many structural forms of damage that I'm worried that, like, you know, the hotter it gets, the more our records will crumble. Our history is in the archives right now, crumbling. I promise you that the government's budget is allotted to so many other things as a priority over and above documents that are 100, 200, 300 years old. And unfortunately, that means that if the records that were sitting in these very well-funded climate-controlled repositories like the Moravian Church Archives in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, or the British National Archives in London, if they come to Antigua, you know, where would we keep them? How would we keep them? You know, we would need a whole lot more support, a lot more technology, a lot more money to make this happen. It is absolutely a part of the story of the underdevelopment of colonialism that Antiguans cannot afford, and most Caribbean islands as well cannot afford to keep their records of their enslaved past completely in-house, that they have to stay somewhere else, that you can't just go down the, you know, to the archives or, you know, civil registries and go back far enough to tell the history of your family into the period of slavery. You just can't do it. For most people, it's impossible. The other question of whether there's more writing on Antigua, there is. There's a few people who have written book-length studies about Antigua, and I'm gonna put my email in the chat. So please email me if you would like to sort of get, you know, a further book list, because there are a few. There are a few, you know, and I certainly depended on them. There are people who've written dissertations, and there are a few that have published studies, some independent, some with academic presses, some with mainstream presses about Antigua's history. So I'd be happy, you know, for anybody who wants to follow up, because I love when people tell me they're history enthusiasts, because I grew up hearing people say that they hated history when I loved it. And I didn't understand why. And I realized as I got older and I got more, you know, sort of educated in the pedagogy of history, I realized a lot of people just had the wrong teachers, that didn't really let them know that, you know, all of us are products of history and that we all make history. So yes, thank you for all of your points. The stuff around Antigua's social character now as a result of the social character of the past, a resounding yes. I mean, most of us probably have an elder either in our parents' generation, maybe a parent or a grandparent. Like I have my grandfather, for instance, had 17 children, I think. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? Like one time, I'll tell you a funny story. I was in the 125th Street Old Navy buying uniform pants for my son. And I heard two ladies speaking and I was like, oh, you two are from Antigua. I'm not asking you, I'm telling you. And they were like, who are you? Where are you from? And I was like, oh, my family's from Atos. And they were like, who's your family? I said, Willie Carr. I'm like, oh, he had a lot of kids. I was like, yeah, that's the guy. You got him right. That's the one. You know, I got a lot of cousins I can't really identify. One time I was walking with my mother in town and she was just like, you know, yeah, that's your family. Who? Like that kind of thing. I've never seen this person before in my life. What are you talking about? But that's what happens, right? When people are just sort of making family happen at will wherever they can. And that kind of thing goes back to slavery and the non-permanence of the presence of people, right? I don't know if it's okay, but I just know that's what people did. Do you know what I mean? And we're at a place now where you don't have to do that, but people still kind of do that. And so, you know, it's a question of what we're willing to sort of participate in and see as a structure that could govern our own lives, right? Like there are ways to do all of it ethically. That's the problem. People didn't do it quite ethically in those days. And so, you know, if we want to talk about queer, heterodox family formations in Black communities now, we might want to talk about ways to practice that queerness ethically, let's say. So Patrice, your point about sort of the casual misogyny of Pan-Africanist spaces is very well taken. And I've heard this from, you know, activists, from, you know, folks who are in academia, that there are times where in the name of sort of upholding the Black race, right? That there's still a certain type of patriarchy embedded in it. And so the expectation is ultimately that, you know, like we have to have Black men on the top, so to speak. And it limits our ability to understand that women can lead, that as much as they can also follow it. It limits our ability to see, you know, like the possibility for the citizenship of everybody, queer people included. I've actually talked a lot about, funny enough, one of my most important points, I think, as a member of the Reparations Commission for Antigua, is to raise the fact that, you know, like the problems of how queer people in the present are sort of, you know, treated and understood legally as sort of, you know, aberrations is tied to the history of slavery. Like the statutes against quote unquote cross-dressing and quote unquote sodomy actually go back to the statutes against vagrancy that punished newly freed people for not being able to prove that they had somewhere decent to live and work if they weren't under the tutelage and, you know, sort of like guidance essentially of white people. Like if they weren't working for white people and they weren't living on white people's property, they were seen as vagrants. And that was subject to fines, hard labor, etc. All of that is the stuff from which the other statutes, like queerness is defined as a form of vagrancy, ultimately, in the current day Caribbean. And so all of the work that, you know, organizations like CAISO or JFLAG or et cetera are trying to get these statutes off the books, all of the sort of activist lawyers that are doing that work to look specifically at the legal statutes that come out of slavery. So all of this is tied up. So thank you, Patrice, for raising some of that stuff for me. I also would say that an example in my research of sort of the small acts of resistance, there was one man who came to visit the plantations in Antigua just before emancipation, and he got really angry at the fact that after the amelioration regulations got passed, there was this push to make pregnant women have healthier pregnancies because they were working too hard and they were not carrying their children to term. But the rest that was now mandated for pregnant women, apparently, according to this observer, he was mad at. He kept saying, how are pregnancies lasting more than 9 months? Why are y'all resting for like 10 and 11 months? You know, and I was thinking to myself, oh, I love that. They are like, you know, carving out a little extra time. And I'm not mad at that. Wherever you can carve out the time, you should. Also, the practice of Saint Monday. If you only had Sundays off and you went out drinking and hanging out on Sunday, sometimes you just might not make it to work on Monday, at least not on time. And that was a practice known as Saint Monday in the English working class tradition. And I love a Saint Monday. It's one of the reasons why I tend not to teach on Mondays now. Okay, so last question that I did not get to was Daryl's. Subtle resistance in the current Columbia campus climate is really something. because I will say that what's interesting about it for me, what's really intriguing and dare I say troubling, to use the word of the hour, there are only Black and brown security functioning at these various carceral stops on campus, right? Like you can only get onto campus if a Black or a brown person scans your ID. And the people who they have to be most suspicious of, that they're trained to be most suspicious of, are Black and brown faculty and staff and students. And so this set of, interactions is one that is very much tied to the fact that I constantly tell my students, you don't need white people sometimes to sort of extend the virtues and the tenets of white supremacy. Sometimes you just need the structure, and there will be people who are either forced to or willingly will participate in it, right? And I think a lot of these people they just want jobs. Like, you know what I mean? I can't fault them for the fact that Columbia had a whole bunch of hiring for people where they just could sit all day and scan IDs. Like, I can't be mad at them wanting to take that job on, even though that job creates another level of carcerality that I am deeply uncomfortable with as a Black woman, who does not want any sort of, interactions with authority in uniform to escalate in any way, because I feel immediately unsafe. The stuff that was happening on campus starting last year with the protests, as I'm sure you all might have seen on the news, right? Like it just got so out of hand. And the campus administration let all of the cops run amok here. Every time we would gather on the steps to protest on behalf of the right for tuition dollars not to be invested in blowing up children on the other side of the earth, there would be like hundreds of cops, helicopters, it just was outrageous. And I would just say, I need to leave. I need to go uptown. I need to get home to my kids in one piece. I can't get arrested with y'all. Like some students in the movement were like, y'all aren't getting arrested in this. I was like, who's gonna take care of my children if I get arrested tonight? Like, I love y'all, but I can't, there's a limit to what I can do, me personally, right? But yeah, so the whole idea of even what happens and how do I resist, funny enough, I would say that you talked about asserting dominance, and it's interesting because I think that's very coded male. Like for me, the way I avoid that kind of stuff is by like having a certain rapport with security folks that makes me feel like we're all exploited employees of this university. We're all just trying to get uptown or to Brooklyn or to Queens or wherever white part of the city we all live and dwell in and find safer than these very kind of like spaces where white property and values need to be protected, through a badge, a gun, a battering ram, etc. Right? So the other form of resistance that I practice, which has always been silently what I have done since the beginning, right? Because I've been teaching here now for 17 years. I make no qualms about the fact that I am here because other Black women were willing to be first. I am the second Black woman ever hired in my department and ever tenured. And the first is still here and still teaching. Black first should not be a thing in 2025, but they are. They absolutely are. And they're still alive and well and walking around. They're not from like old black and white pictures. Like the Black first to be hired, the Black woman first hired in this department was hired like, like just 20 years before me, right? So they're averaging like one every 15 to 20 years because the next Black woman was hired 15 years after me, right? So we're now at a grand total of 3. So I'll tell you, the other way I resist is just thinking about the fact that the first Black woman to ever walk onto this campus did so in chains. And so that's who I'm in solidarity with. That's who I'm here for. That's who really made space for any of us to be here. So that's also a way I kind of resist by thinking there's something so much more meaningful in my presence here. I don't know if that's a helpful answer to everything, but that you raised, Daryl, but yeah, that's kind of where I would leave it. So yeah, we've gone way over. I need to go home.
Oh, this is amazing. Thank you everyone for your questions.
Thank you.
Really thoughtful. Serene Prince, I think, had a comment.
Yeah.
Serene, are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say this is wonderful, but I just encourage those who are living in Antigua and Barbuda or maybe returning to get this book. And if you can form communities or groups where you can dissect chapter 5, many of the things that are written look very similar to present day, unfortunately. Yes, domestic violence, subjugation of Black women is everywhere. But Dr. Lightfoot, thank you too, as points it that Antigua is very small. So to be able to escape being sexually abused, being abused by your partner, it's like this. You know, first of all, you need to have a visa. So pray to God you have a visa. And then any movement that you make, other people are seeing it and they're saying it to someone else. And it just makes it really hard. And I just really want to encourage those to form communities, dissect chapter 5, validate one another, empower one another for progress. Reparations, I don't know whatever will happen with that, but before reparations come, we need to be informed, we need to be educated, and we need to know about where we were so we can know where we're going forward. So I just wanted to say that. And it's a fantastic book. And I know that many in the Caribbean and Antigua and Barbuda have difficult times talking about the intersectionality with religion and the abuse of women. And that's another reason why you don't hear or see discussions about it, but you have the power to do that. So I can't say it enough. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much. This was really wonderful.
Thank you, Serene.
No honor to share this work with this space.
Yeah, I just want to also thank you, Dr. Lightfoot, for your time and your expertise, especially around the way that your text resists the romanticization of Black solidarity and resistance, especially your point about not pathologizing the violence that Black people, Black women turned to each other. So thank you once again. And I just want to let everyone know that in the future, we will be sharing a handout with the key takeaways from this session, which will be designed by Lucia Murray and written by myself. So please be on the lookout for that. And we will definitely be including the list of texts that Dr. Lightfoot will be emailing to all of you when you reach out to her. So thanks everyone. And I hope that you'll join us again for our next teach-in. Please, if you haven't opened the link to the feedback form, please do so. We would love to hear from you, Lucia. As people leave, can you share the link again? Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody. Take care.